My name is Robert Desk and I'm coming to you today from the Cumberland Martial Arts Academy. This video can be found on the Forge. It's our resource center and it's basically dealing with chum Q, the second Wing Chun hand form. We have Sum Tao, chum Q, and Biu Ji. Today we're going to go through chum Q. Okay, so basically the first thing you have to know is that in order to interpret the forms, the best thing to do is apply a set of rules. The rules that we're going to go over today are the individual's perspective. It deals with the individual's perspective, not anybody else, not the opponent's perspective, but the individual who's doing the forms. If it's me that's doing the form, then it's my perspective. It does not deal, like forms are taught, so that's rule number one. Rule number two is forms are taught in sequence, but you don't have to follow the sequence in order to apply the principles that are learned in the sequence. Number three, forms do not deal with multiple opponents. And number four, forms are not for long-range punches and kicks. We're going to take these rules one at a time and go over them where you can find them in the form. Okay, so basically the first rule is from an individual's perspective. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce a couple of guys that helped me a lot at the club. This is my partner and the head Wing Chun instructor, Harry Sito, and also one of our most dedicated students, Corey Van Hoof. Right, Van Hoof? That's right. Okay, very good. Okay, so they're going to be helping me out with the presentation and the forms. So the first thing I want to go over is basically the forms are from an individual's perspective. And in order to define that or to demonstrate that, I'm going to use the first couple of movements in the form. When we do the first three shifts, 1, 2, 3, that's basically showing me how I want to enter on the opponent. And it's saying that if I enter with my left side, like from my left, then my right leg is back. If I enter from my right side, from my right, then my left leg is back. And I'll borrow Harry here for a second. So Harry just stands here. That's good. So basically if I'm coming in from my right side, you'll see that I have my left leg back. And that's defined in the first shift. If I enter from my left side, here, then I have my right leg back. And that's just for my own stability, for my own best results when I enter. Okay, so because if I enter from my right side and I have my opposite leg back, I'm not as structurally sound. As here, I can put up with some resistance, some strength, and still be stable and supported. So that's basically the first. The forms are taught in sequence, but they don't have to follow a sequence in order to be applied. So what that's saying is that in order to learn something, the best way to learn something is to follow a certain order. But you don't have to follow the order to apply what you're learning. What you're doing is you're identifying principles and you're applying those principles whenever the condition is met. If you look at the beginning of the form, we do 3 shifts. Yes, we have the weight in the back leg, but we're also identifying the principle of where the majority of the weight is carried. It's carried in the back leg. Regardless of the percentage, it's usually, it could be 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10. The form depicts a multitude of different arrangements for that weight transfer, for the percentage change. But the majority of the weight is always on the back leg, so therefore that's a principle that's identified. But we don't have to group them together. So if I took the example of the shift, this shift is for the weight in the back leg, but it's also breaking balance, breaking the opponent's balance, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. Furthermore, we're identifying that my hands are busy, so I should use my feet. That's another portion that's being linked into the principle. So I could follow this kind of example here. So let's say Harry punches. I bridge center, I go for a lop, and as I'm controlling the center here, I'm maintaining the weight on the back leg as I go around to control his balance, and when my hands are busy, I use the feet for the final takedown. So those principles are being applied out of sequence because I don't use a kick throughout this sequence. A little bit later on in the form, I shift. My hands are occupied, so I use my feet. So I'm showing you that my hands are occupied, I use my feet. A little bit later in the form, I'll transfer the weight to the back leg as I shift, so I only have 90%. And if you look at what we did here, I did the lock, control the bridge, so hands replaces hands, put the weight over as I'm only having 90% of the weight on the back leg and only 10% on the front. I'm controlling his balance while I'm breaking his balance, using my feet because my hands are occupied to take balance. So there you're seeing multiple principles being applied out of sequence. So it's important to be able to identify the principles and link them as the conditions are required. Forms are not for multiple opponents. The name says it all. Forms are the name of the form, chum Q, is searching the bridge. So just like in Chi Sao, when we do Chi Sao, I search the bridge for my control. It's what the form is depicting. It's what the form is identifying. Searching the bridge, not fighting multiple opponents. I turn left, I turn right, there's multiple opponents coming at me. No, no. The whole form depicts strategies for dealing with a bridge or a clinch style engagement, not multiple opponents. The form chum Q is not for long range punches and kicks. Just like the previous rule, we're talking about a clinch. I might have to deal with finding the bridge. How he throws a punch, I find the bridge. Yeah, sure, I engage. But once I've engaged, once the bridge has been established, I'm searching for the resolutions. I'm searching for control. I'm searching for a way to finish, to hit with impunity. That's what the form is detailing. Not long range. He throws a punch, here's how I stop that. He throws a kick, here's how I stop that. This is not the range. Once the bridge is established, whether I engage with the hands, whether I engage with the feet, I deal with fixing the problem once bridge is established. Hand replaces hand. Basically, that's the fourth rule. Okay, so with those 4 rules identified, it's not enough to be able to take the rule and individually relate to it. The 4 rules for best results have to be applied together. So for example, from my perspective, they're taught in sequence, but they don't have to be in sequence to be applied. They're not for multiple opponents, and they're not for long range. All together, that's summing up the form's principle, chum Q. So it's all detailing all the 4 rules together, applying how you should take things and try to interpret what you're learning so that you can identify properly the principles and are able to glean the most out of the principles. But one thing has to be understood. In order to get the most out of chum Q, you have to not just let chum Q sit by itself. None of the system of Wing Chun sits individually. Sulim Tao, chum Q, Biu Ji, Chi Sao, Muk Jong, Pa Chum Do, Luk Tim Bung Pon, any of the basic drills that are identified on the wall, none of the systems sits independently. Wing Chun is not a martial arts style. Wing Chun is a method of martial arts education. So therefore the style becomes how the student best responds to the education of what Wing Chun is laying out in front of you. Your structure, your center line, hand replaces hand, your principles. And you learn all this by one thing leveraging another. Sulim Tao is leveraged by chum Q, which is leveraged by Biu Ji. The Muk Jong is leveraged. Chi Sao is leveraged throughout the exercise. So if you're looking for understanding chum Q, you have to look at Chi Sao. A lot of the things that you study from Chi Sao are identified in chum Q. When we say hand replaces hand, this is where we're learning how the hand replaces the hand. We're learning all that from Chi Sao. Chi Sao is the exercise in which those aspects are drilled, trained, and become auto-responses. So without leveraging Chi Sao, you can't have a firm understanding of chum Q. Just like the rest of the system all is bolted together, or we call that in Wing Chun terms the Fat Do, the way of Wing Chun. Or the way, my Sifu calls it, framework. The framework that holds the essence of the system together. The conceptual framework is what his term is. The Fat Do is the Wing Chun terminology for that reference. Everything leans on each other in order to get the full picture. So just like that, the chum Q doesn't stand by itself. So that's important to understand that. And at this point here, what I'd like to do is identify each of the principles that the chum Q starts to identify. And I might show a small example of how those principles are identified. So basically, if I'm looking at the stance, Yiji Kinyama is the stance that the form starts on. my hands come down to the side, and I practice straight out and relax so that I practice the elbow recoil. So that is identified, so whenever I'm punching, I sink the bridge on the punch. So here, I punch, boom! I'm controlling that elbow recoil. So on the hit, I control the elbow recoil so that I have good firm sinking of the bridge, controlling the bridge. Furthermore, I go from side to side. So shift, shift, shift. So I'm identifying the principle of the weight on the rear leg, which I discussed earlier. If I go a little bit further into form than that, I'll just look at my chart here, identifying the principle of receiving or finding the bridge, establishing the bridge. It's how he punches, boom. So I'm showing you that here. And that doesn't have to be just here. It doesn't mean he's going to punch like this all the time. It doesn't mean that he's going to throw a straight punch and I'm going to go in. He could easily throw a looping punch, in which case I'll address it this way. But again, I've established bridge control here. And if we are to hypothesize for a second, Harry throws a big looping punch, comes around, and I engage. Harry's not going to allow him to live with this. He's going to probably address it, in which case, hand replaces hand. So that's how the principles work with each other. The next principle I have on my chart here is structure for integrity. I define that here. Boom! I'm showing you that my structure is for my integrity. And where do we find that example in the form? Well, when we come on the third line, we're doing a series of low bong saos, dai bong sao. So that's showing you right away, if I borrow my friend, and I'll show you an example out of Chi Sao, if I was to bring his boom, notice how he fell forward, his posture is broken, just because I grabbed his structure and forced him down. Now if I was to bring his structure and down, he just drops his wrist, raises his elbow, just like the Dai Bong Sao. And it allows his structure to maintain its integrity. So his structure is what defines his integrity. And the structure is learned in Sulam Tao. So you see the relationship now. That the Sulam Tao does not stand by itself, but feeds for further relation to the foundation of your Kung Fu. Another form, we do Bong Sao. From here, we come out, we do Bong Sao, then we come back, Lan Sao, then we do another Bong Sao. We do it 3 times. It doesn't always have to be from the same type of Bong Sao. So for example, Harry punches. Let's say he punches perfect. Yeah, that's fine. I do a Bong Sao here. This is a good Bong Sao because my rib cage is not in any threat from this hand. So Bong Sao good, I take place so that I can retake center, so that I can hit. But it doesn't always mean that I'm going to deflect energy from this side here. It could have been the other hand and I deflected energy out of an emergency and I find myself where I have my rib cage open. Now in order to fix that, if he goes to punch, I want to do a lap da before taking the center line. And that's defined here. 1, there's your lap da motion. 2, you're showing it 3 times. But what you're saying here is before taking the line, Bong Sao, come back with lap if you need to because you have to close your ribs so that you can retake the line. So that's shown in the first section example. Ultimately there's 3 Bong Saos that you're seeing, or 3 versions of the Bong Sao that you're seeing. You're seeing the Bong Sao standard where you're shifting to basically if you find yourself threatened by a punch where it's entering your own personal space, you shift it away. Could happen from the other hand, you shift it away, but you have to recover structure to recover. You also see a Bong Sao, should I take line and the hook punch comes around, I have a jamming Bong Sao. And I also have a Bong Sao that if I take his hand down, boom, his elbow flies up, his wrist takes center, and he maintains his structure with his Dai Bong Saos. In other words, they all share one commonality between all 3 styles or versions of the Bong Sao. They all maintain space. The punch, I shift, maintain space. The hook punch, I jam, maintain space. The lock, boom, maintain space. So all 3 Bong Saos share a common denominator. They maintain space, but they can be accessed or referenced to in different ways. So that's a principle that needs to be identified. Another principle that I'm writing down here, that principle is identified here. Hands, squeezing the hands show that they're busy. Use my feet if my hands become busy. So that could look something like, he does a punch, he throws a hook, boom, hands are busy. Boom, disbalance. Use my feet to disbalance so that I can carry on. Okay? So that shows that principle. But another thing that is shown in the principle is when we do the 3 bong styles here, at the very end we come up here, I just referenced that here and I kind of want to point it out, is we did the demonstration where I braced from a punch, could have been a jab, whatever, and he throws a hook, follow up, I just bounce, boom, but look where it places his head. It places his head in perfect position for a knee strike. So that's showing you that as the bridge control for maintaining control of the opponent should his posture be broken. So that's a principle that also needs to be identified and that can be gleaned, once more, out of order and applied when the condition is satisfied. What else do I have written on the form? Don't apply the rules the way I pointed them out. There's a good chance you might misidentify a principle or probably point out a principle that really doesn't hold up to the rules scrutiny, which case it might not be the right interpretation. If we were allowed to just run amok and create all kinds of rules anytime we see something without any protocols to identify whether the rule is accurate or not, the form could be hours long. But as we all know, the form is not hours long. It's maybe 5 minutes long, maybe not even, a couple of minutes only. So it has not a long duration. And that's trying out is that you can identify all the necessary principles in a short form, providing you apply the proper rules against its interpretation, so you don't end up inventing principles or scenarios that have no business being there. Okay, for example, if I'm thinking that when I turn one side to the other side that I'm facing multiple opponents, right away I'm leading myself down a misinterpretation of the form. By applying the rules, I can eliminate that thought process and restrict myself to what the form is really trying to show me. That's why those rules are useful to try to identify or determine chum Q. So it's open for your own interpretation. You can take from it what you will, but this is mine. And if it helps you in some way to better understand your Wing Chun, then I hope that it helps you to, and serves you well down your Wing Chun path. Thank you for listening.